With the other Souls YouTubers hyping up Code Vein recently, the intersectionality of anime and Dark Souls is upon us, and there's no better anime Souls game out right now than Momodora Reverie Under the Moonlight. Momodora is an indie metroidvania title that released in early 2016. It offers strategic combat, a focus on bosses, and a healing checkpoint system similar to that of the Souls series, coupled with beautiful pixel art graphics and a bit of anime-ness. To be fair, definitely not as much as Code Vein though. Reverie Under the Moonlight is the fourth installment in the Momodora series, but doesn't require any knowledge or experience with the previous games. You play as Kaho, a leaf-wielding priestess who travels to the Kingdom of Karst to end the source of a darkness which is plaguing her land. You have two weapons, a leaf, which acts as your sword, and a bow. This, plus an invincible roll, makes up the majority of your combat tools, similar to Souls. The combat is responsive and satisfying. It has a consumable heal that recharges at checkpoint markers like Souls 2. In this game, bells serve as bonfires, restoring your health and consumables, saving your progress, and eventually allowing you to warp between zones. However, this mechanic isn't exactly a one-to-one match as Souls. In Dark Souls, each death sends you back to a bonfire without any of your souls or experience points. But the world is exactly as it is when you died. If you had opened up a shortcut right before your death, the shortcut would still be open. This can create some strategic deaths in that if you sacrifice yourself to open up a shortcut and die after opening up the shortcut, you will still have made progress with that death. But in Momodora, the bells act more like traditional saves. Any progress you make is voided by death if you don't ring a bell. Opening a shortcut or defeating a boss must be saved by ringing a bell. If you die before doing so, you'll have to redo the boss fight or reopen the shortcut. This takes away the ability of a strategic death because any death will reset your experience unless you ring a bell. So speaking of boss fights, they're one of the main focuses of the game. There are 8 boss fights in the game, including one which is repeated and an optional one. There is somewhat of a 9th, but the fight is kind of weird and the boss doesn't have a health bar, so I'm not including him in the list, but I think he counts as a boss fight, I don't know. I did really enjoy every boss fight in the game, even the repeated one. Each boss was stylistically different in visuals and gameplay, and although some were a bit exploitable to cheese, they were all an engaging challenge. I felt each one was a different fight, each one was engaging, fun, had their different mechanics. Even the boss, which had a hitbox of giant boobs, was a pretty fun fight. That's the anime side of the game showing. Overall, the difficulty was a bit lower than a Souls game, but each fight ended with a significant feeling of accomplishment and achievement. Going through the game the first time, each boss did feel like a significant challenge, and subsequent playthroughs allowed for more challenge in trying to beat the boss without getting hit, as you get rewarded with a special item for most of the bosses if you beat them without taking any damage. So overall, difficulty-wise, I'd say there's a satisfying amount. Each boss has its own zone, and each zone matches the thematic differences of the bosses. The game is only around 6 hours, so you're not spending too much time in any one zone. But the time you do spend allows you to really absorb the feeling that was intended for each zone. The visuals and backgrounds are done beautifully, and really make the world feel real and immersive. I caught myself disappointed in how much I was focusing on the foreground and enemies, because I was missing out on some of the great backgrounds, which really absorbed me and I would just sit and stare for a while at something. Kaho and the NPCs were actually given a good amount of expression, even despite the fact that they're semi-basic sprites. I was really surprised by how much tone they often expressed in their little animations and facial expressions. I totally got the intended feeling when Cath gave a bit of an inquisitive and accusatory finger point, or whenever Kaho gets a bit confused at some other character's questions. The music and sound design weren't quite as good as the visuals, but they were still pretty great. The music is generally pretty minimal, with either no background music or light tunes, but it matches with the mood of each zone really well. The soundtracks for the bosses are well done and emotional. They definitely add to each fight. And while I didn't find any of them to be horribly memorable, I still really enjoyed each one. The sound effects often match the SNES Game Boy style that the visuals harken back to. A lot of the attacks and explosions reminded me of Gen 1 and 2 Pokemon attack sound effects that I used to hear on my Game Boy, which was a really cool trip of nostalgia for me. The world design captures a great interconnectivity and exploration focus that adds to the immersion the visuals and sound set up. The world is a blast to sift and search through, and I found myself really enthralled with searching and trying to figure out where I was. The world map helps you keep some amount of bearings concerning your location so you don't get totally lost. What really makes this work is that the game opens up after the tutorial area and allows you to choose where you want to go for essentially all of the mid-game. You need 4 pieces of a crest to access the final 2 areas, but the order in which you get these pieces is completely up to you. This means that there's a ton of variety in the next 4 zones because you get to decide which order they're played in. And each crest piece gives you a significant ability upgrade in metroidvania fashion, like being able to warp between bells or dodge mid-air. This gives a real sense of progression. You'll also receive smaller gear upgrades either through purchasing items, finding secrets, or being rewarded for beating bosses without taking damage, like I said before. These upgrades include things like poison damage on your arrows or defensive spells. These items and the crest pieces really let the gameplay progress so that fighting the final boss feels radically different than fighting the first one. Although you still can beat the final boss using only the tools from the beginning of the game, which again allows for a significant player choice. You can either try and max out, find every item, and use every tool in your kit to beat the later bosses, or you can keep it very vanilla and use only a couple upgrades or none at all, and stick to the same fighting style the whole game. An additional point on this side of progression, unlike Souls, there isn't a leveling system in this game. Monies, which are this game's experience points, are only used to purchase items, and the only way to increase damage output is through items or weapon upgrades, which are again item based. You're never spending any time min-maxing if it's better to increase your health or defense or something like that, because those things are only affected by item pickups, like vitality upgrades which you find scattered throughout the world. On the characters and story, it maintains a Souls approach of bare-bones explanations, short NPC interactions, and subtle hints throughout the game. There isn't much development in most of the characters, as they are generally pretty static, having fairly unchanging dialogue and remaining in the same place. One character I mentioned before, Cath, gets some screen time and even helps out in one of the boss fights. But other than her, there's not much going on character-wise. There are a couple small character progressions as you explore through the game that do add to the world, but it's nothing significant and there's not a lot of significant character development, which is okay as the game doesn't make it a priority, but having more of that is always nice. The story is briefly explained to the player and item descriptions give more exposition about the world. It isn't anything super deep or narratively enthralling, but the small character stories help build a fairly dark and somber game, which juxtaposes interestingly with Kaho's overall happier demeanor. The story and characters help get the job done to allow the gameplay, visuals, and sound to sustain a really great game. Although the game is pretty short, it's quite a ride. It's only $10, and I'd say it's very worth it as I've already gone through the game about 3 times and have had a great time in each playthrough. The exploration, world connectivity, and strategic combat are all done well enough to the point that I'd say almost any Souls fan would quite enjoy this game, and everything else comes together to make this a great game in its own right. So that about ends up most of my opinions on Momodora Reverie Under the Moonlight. I really recommend it, and thank you for watching the video. See ya in the next one.